Hello. Welcome back to That Can't Be Right, a podcast about exploring structural wrongs, cultural oddities, and wild opinions. I am your host, Ryan Rogan. And since the last episode of That Can't Be Right, the ocean ended up on fire. Thermometers in the Pacific Northwest reached previously unheard of levels. The U.S. military did a walk of shame out of Afghanistan. The Olympics banned spectators and Black women. Things are going great. But Zayla Avant-Garde won the Scripps Spelling Bee, and that was a unifying moment of happiness on my timeline. But before we jump into the interview, you know the deal. Please subscribe and review That Can't Be Right wherever you get your podcasts. Follow along at TCBR Pod on Twitter and Instagram to get my opinion on headlines that can't be right. Most recently, Stephen A. Smith talking about Shohei Ohtani, but also Stephen A. Smith talking about anything. Enough of that. It's time to dive into the 2020 election, not the results. Those are locked in. I'm following the money. A month before the election, campaign spending had already reached $14 billion. $14 billion in legal tender during a pandemic when people were dealing with COVID, unemployment, food and housing insecurity, and a host of other issues. I'm trying to wrap my mind around that number, where that money even goes, and more importantly, where it came from. So, my guest today is Ciara Torres-Spelliscy. Professor Ciara is a Brennan Center Fellow and Professor of Law at Stetson University College of Law, where she teaches courses in election law, corporate governance, business entities, and constitutional law. Prior to joining Stetson's faculty, Professor Ciara was counsel in the Brennan Center's democracy program, where she provided guidance on money and politics and the judiciary to state and federal lawmakers. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So let's jump right into it. $14 billion in campaign spending in 2020. Any updates to that number?
Well, every presidential election cycle has been more expensive than the last presidential election cycle, with the exception of 2016. So 2016 was an outlier in many different ways. And one of the ways it was is that it was actually cheaper than the previous election, which was 2012. But in general, we're always on an upward trajectory in terms of the amount of money in politics that is spent every cycle. So every midterm has consistently also been more expensive than its predecessor. And 2020 continued in that normal upward trend. And so right now, the final total is somewhere between $14 billion and $15 billion for the federal elections alone. That doesn't take account of any state elections or local elections, which have their own crazy price tags. And this trend is one of the things that I find troubling, in part because I just think that wealth is not a good proxy for talent.
100%. Because I learned recently that the amount of money you fundraise, it kind of dictates and determines who gets to participate in early debates on either sides of the aisle. So definitely agree that it's not a good proxy for whether or not you might be a good leader or anything like that. So $14 billion, that's at the federal level. Like you said, there's more money at the state and local level. One question I'll ask before I kind of stick to the roadmap we laid out before we started. What do you think that this level of spending means for the 2022 midterms?
Well, if trends continue, then we can expect a particularly expensive midterm election. I think that was always going to be the case, but we probably have a perfect storm of a ex-president who still is wildly claiming that he won the last election.
Yeah.
And I, if it was just him, then I would ignore it. But polling has shown that a majority of Republicans actually believe him. And that's where I think this becomes really dangerous and troubling. So I think as a consequence, people who think that the 2020 election was wrongly decided may pour in extra money into the midterm so that there's a Republican House and a Republican Senate, and that will hamper the ability of the Biden administration to get any of its priorities through. And from the point of view of judicial appointments, it will mean that even if there's an opening on the Supreme Court, Senator Mitch McConnell has already made it pretty clear that he will do the same thing that he did to Merrick Garland and President Obama. He will hold open a Supreme Court seat until there is a Republican president. So this could get enormously ugly very quickly. And one of the ways that it'll get ugly quickly is through enormous spending on House and Senate races in 2022.
Excellent. One, I would love to do an episode on how Mitch McConnell exists, but I'll stay focused for now. How did we get here? Like, how did the campaign spending balloon to such levels in 2020? I know you said 2016 was an outlier in the level of spending, but how did we get here? How is so much money going into this process?
Well, there are a lot of explanations for why there's so much money in politics in America compared to our peer countries. One is that we are not running a parliamentary system. And that means that there are fights over who is in Congress, fights over who becomes president, and all of that is a separate fight. So in a parliamentary system, you basically just have a legislative fight, and then whoever the legislative leader becomes the prime minister. But we have extra spending, essentially, in our system because of our structure. We also don't have snap elections. So all of our elections at the federal level are determined by the Constitution. So every 4 years, we elect a president. Every 2 years, we elect members of Congress. And every 6 years, we elect a third of the Senate. And that means that the time to campaign can expand to the length of time between elections, which is different than if you have a system like in England where you can have snap elections. You can call an election very quickly, which means that you can only campaign for so long, which means you can only spend money on the campaign for so long. Mm-hmm. But what has happened in the United States is we have perpetual elections. So especially in the House, where they're up for re-election every 2 years, they're on a fundraising treadmill. And that means that especially our freshman members of Congress are continually dialing for dollars, trying to raise the $1 million that they need in order to run a competitive re-election campaign. And for a while, that wasn't true of Senate and presidential races. But for example, President Trump, the day he was inaugurated, he started his re-election campaign. Mm-hmm. And that means that he was always running for re-election starting from day one. And that type of behavior is being seen in certain Senate races. And we'll see whether Joe Biden does that. I think.
Yeah.
He's sort of a different type of figure. So he may not be as obsessed with re-election, in part because of his age. But I think he has to think about money in politics to be competitive. So we'll see what happens with Biden and campaign financing for round two. And I think I may have lost my train of thought.
That's okay. That's okay. I'll jump in with another question and we'll try to get back on track. Actually, my question probably won't help, but it's about former President Trump's campaign fundraising efforts. A lot has been made of like the fine print in his emails that he sends out or would send out to his supporters after the election, fundraising for the legal battle about where the money goes. Like actually some of this money is going to be used to settle our campaign debts. Is that common practice or is that a weird Trump thing?
So financing a campaign is a little bit weird. It's almost like almost nothing else in adult life. So for one, you can have a campaign that is just sort of wildly expensive. And so you've had candidates over the years do things like take a second mortgage out on their house. That's what John Kerry did when he was running for president. And that was one of his ways of demonstrating his faith in his own campaign. It also sort of showed you how expensive the campaigns can be because he's married to a very wealthy woman. And the idea that like the Kerrys didn't have enough money on hand to run that campaign is sort of horrifying. And sort of similarly in the 2016 campaign, Trump seemed to be selling assets in order to raise money for his campaign, which may indicate that he's not the cash-rich billionaire that he claims to be. But it does all speak to just the enormous expense of this. And in terms of retiring debts, then Senator Hillary Clinton, when she ran in 2008, ended up with quite a deficit in her campaign. And she spent years slowly paying off that debt. And under the FEC rules, she was able to raise money essentially to retire that debt. And you have to raise all of that money in hard money increments, which it depends on the year you're talking about, but it tends to be roughly $2,500. It changes year by year because it's adjusted on a COLA as a cost of living adjustment. And so depending on what year you're in, it's like it's 2,400, it's 2,500, et cetera, et cetera. But raising millions of dollars in that small a chunk takes an enormous amount of time. But retiring debt is something that candidates do. What's really sort of peculiar about what Trump has been doing post-2020 is, number one, he is raising funds using the big lie. So he is saying to people, I was really the winner of the 2020 election when he was not. And he has had great success in fundraising off of this sort of nonsense. And he can use that money for a 2024 run if he decides to run for president again. He can give it to other candidates for office. He can give it to political parties. He can give it to charities, so long as it's not a charity that he runs. But he cannot put it into his own pocket. And this, I think, gets really misunderstood. But there are these things called personal use rules at the federal level. And it's one of the ways you can actually end up going to prison is if you pocket campaign funds that were really intended for your reelection, and instead you use it as a, for your personal benefit. So Trump can do this type of fundraising, but he has to use that campaign money for a legitimate campaign purpose.
Okay. That makes sense. Let me kind of jump to like legitimate campaign purposes. Like, where does this money flow? So I'm thinking in particular about 2020 elections, Senate elections in North Carolina and Kentucky, where the Democratic candidates are running against huge incumbents, Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell. record-breaking fundraising, and they lost. I feel like there could have been a surplus of money after the election. What happens with the money then, if there's a surplus?
So if you have a surplus, it's sort of similar to what I said before. You can use it on your next reelection campaign. You can give it to other candidates. You can give it to political parties. You can give it to a charity that you do not control, but you cannot pocket it.
Okay.
It is not your money.
Same thing goes. Okay. Looking at kind of the structures in place, the organizations, the different players, what did something like Citizens United do to the campaign finance process? And actually, what is Citizens United? Because I feel like a lot of people see it in the news or reference it, but maybe don't understand like the full scope of what happened, the context, and the consequences.
Sure. Citizens United versus FEC is a Supreme Court case from 2010. It was a challenge by a nonprofit called Citizens United, who put out a film called Hillary the Movie. And they wanted to run Hillary the Movie in states where then Senator Clinton was a frontrunner for the Democratic nomination in 2008. And because of that, it triggered the campaign finance rules, which at the time banned corporations from funding political ads. And the Federal Election Commission, who regulates money in politics at the federal level, took the position, I think rightly, that this was a political ad and that they were being cute by making it a 90-minute documentary. They also ran mini ads for the documentary, and the ads for the documentary looked like any other political ad, basically attacking Hillary Clinton. And so the FEC said you cannot broadcast these on TV because they're partially funded by for-profit corporations. And then Citizens United, the group, sued, and it took years and years for it to get to the Supreme Court. It's actually argued at the Supreme Court twice, once in 2009 in the spring, and then in 2009 in the fall. And then after the second oral argument, the Supreme Court decides in January of 2010 that not only can this nonprofit corporation spend an unlimited amount on its movie attacking Hillary Clinton, but the language in the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United is written by Justice Kennedy, and he writes it extraordinarily broadly. And he writes it so broadly that it doesn't just cover nonprofit corporations, it covers all for-profit corporations as well, every multinational corporation, and says that they all have a First Amendment right to spend in U.S. elections. And by U.S. elections, I mean federal, state, and local. And that was a right that corporations didn't have before that. Before that, there were several different laws at the federal level and in half of the states that banned corporations from spending in elections. And Citizens United not only got rid of the federal rules against corporations spending on political ads, it also got rid of the laws in half of the states that had similar bans. So it was an incredibly broad ruling and far-reaching in its implications, like basically sweeping away the laws of half of the states, meanwhile getting rid of the federal rules on corporate political spending. And so interestingly, corporations, especially at the federal level, have been, I think, hesitant to get involved in federal elections. There could be a number of reasons for that. Number one, it's really high profile. And Number two, there still is a law on the books called the Tillman Act, which bans corporations from giving directly to federal candidates. And so there just may be a hesitancy to get anywhere close to violating the Tillman Act. On the other hand, in 2020, $100 million of the billions we were talking about earlier came from corporate sources.
Mm-hmm.
And the primary way that corporations spend in federal elections is they donate to super PACs. And then the super PAC goes on and spends money typically on political ads.
Okay. I'm going to jump back to what you were saying real quick. You mentioned that Justice Kennedy, in writing the decision, was really broad and, it wiped away states' rights. Did he have to write it so broadly? Has there been any discussion or analysis in why he did so?
Justice Kennedy really hated campaign finance. Actually, he's still alive. He's still with us. I assume he still hates it. But he's no longer on the court. So Justice Kennedy did not, and the Supreme Court did not have to write so broadly. Part of what happened is, so in 2003, which had been the previous ruling on campaign finance from the Supreme Court, that was when Justice Rehnquist was still on the court and Justice O'Connor was still on the court. So Justice Rehnquist dies while he's in office, and Justice O'Connor steps down because her husband is dying, and she steps off of the court to care for him. And they are replaced by Chief Justice John Roberts and Samuel Alito. And one of the big differences that made is, while O'Connor and Rehnquist were not liberals by any stretch of the imagination, they did understand that there was a problem with campaign finance, and that campaign finance had the risk of real gross corruption. And so at the end of the day, when they saw Congress or states trying to limit the role of money in politics through laws or regulations, Rehnquist and O'Connor would uphold those laws and regulations. Enter Samuel Alito and John Roberts. They are ideologically opposed to campaign finance restrictions, much in the vein of Justice Kennedy. So with these new characters on the court, they had a 5-person majority, which is what you need to make new Supreme Court president. And they, in a series of decisions, starting with their very first sitting, they have invalidated every single campaign finance law that has come before them, with the exception of a sort of odd case out of Florida, where they uphold a ban on judicial candidates personally soliciting money for their campaigns, because here in Florida, we elect some of our judges. But except for that case, every single campaign finance law that has come before the Roberts Supreme Court has been struck down. And Citizens United was one of those cases where they looked at a law, part of which, went back to the 1940s, and they said, Congress, you didn't have the constitutional ability to keep corporations out of federal elections. That's unconstitutional. The corporations have a First Amendment right to spend. And so they have been knocking out good campaign finance laws left, right, and center.
Got it. And then going back to what you were saying about the money being funded through the super PACs, I think you mentioned $100 million, or not $100 billion yet. The money going to those super PACs, is that all from corporations, or do individuals make large contributions there too?
Most of the money in super PACs is from wealthy individuals.
Okay.
So one of the things that the Supreme Court decided back in the 1970s is that, you cannot have limits on how much individuals can spend in a federal election, so long as they don't give it directly to candidates. So this is sometimes known as the ability to make independent expenditures. So an independent expenditure in layman's terms tends to be buying political ads. So you buy the political ad and you do it independently of the candidate you're supporting. And so under Buckley versus Vallejo, a case from the 1970s, the Supreme Court basically says rich individuals can spend as much as they want independently. Then when you combine that with Citizens United, which basically says that every corporation can also spend as much as it wants to independently of candidates, that then led to a DC Circuit decision in a case called Speech Now, same year as Citizens United in 2010. And there the question was, what if we make a new type of PAC that only does independent expenditures? Why are we under contribution limits? And the court agreed, post Citizens United, that that would be fine. And that gave birth to the super PAC. So a super PAC is a PAC that spends typically in a federal election, and they can gather in donations of infinite size. So rich individuals, unions, corporations, associations can give to a super PAC, and then the super PAC spends independently. And most of the money that comes into super PACs is actually from rich individuals, because a rich individual can give if they feel like it. Like if you're Sheldon Adelson, who is now not with us anymore, but up until the 2020 election, he was spending lavishly, and he would often spend like $50 million at a time. He would just spend it through a super PAC, which made it look like, I don't know, that he had friends or that other people believed the same things that he believed.
Yeah.
But a lot of the Adelson super PACs, it's like he was basically the only major donor.
This is kind of beyond the scope of the conversation, but are those contributions or personal expenditures, are those like, you can write those off as on your taxes? Do they do that? Do rich people do that? I don't know how being rich works.
No.
Okay.
It's one of the only parts of the tax code that I think is properly written. So giving to a PAC, a super PAC, is not tax deductible. And there's this, actually, I'll that's probably enough tax law for one conversation.
I did a whole episode on it. I can vibe with it, but I'll jump to another question. So, people who don't want to talk about taxes don't get too bored. You've mentioned a couple of times the Federal Election Commission, the FEC. It was Citizens United versus the FEC. To me, it seems like they were kind of kneecapped by the Supreme Court in that decision. Why can't the FEC do more to kind of rein in political spending?
So the Federal Election Commission was post-Watergate reform. Watergate was quite the political scandal for Richard Nixon's White House. He basically, in his re-election campaign in 1972, did all sorts of illegal things. I mean, what he's sort of most famous for is orchestrating a break-in into the DNC's headquarters at the Watergate building, hence the name of the scandal. But when Congress did investigations into that Watergate burglary, one of the things that they discovered is that that burglary was paid for by Nixon's re-election campaign, which had the awesome acronym CREEP. It was the Committee for the Re-election of the President, so CREEP. And so CREEP is doing all of these illegal things, including these break-ins. And then on further inspection, they were also funded illegally. So part of the way that they were illegally funded is that they were funded in violation of the Tillman Act. So the Tillman Act, both then and now, bars corporations from giving to federal candidates. And the Nixon campaign knew this, and despite that, they asked for corporate political donations and got them. And got them in, pretty big chunks for back in the 70s. So, $100,000, which is basically $500,000 today. And it also would show up in literal bags of cash, because everyone knew this was illegal. So they're trying not to have a paper trail. So you literally have bags of cash. And as a reform to all of that, Congress passes the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974. And one of the reforms was the creation of the Federal Election Commission. So it came out of a sort of dark chapter of United States history, but it meant to make things better, including by providing more transparency of money in politics. But its, I think, fatal flaw was they decided to make it an equal number of commissioners and bipartisan. Now, this was not the worst idea in the world, but over time, it has proved to be completely dysfunctional. So the FEC has 6 commissioners, 3 are supposed to be Republicans, 3 Democrats, and they need 4 votes to do almost anything. And so they deadlock 3-3 all the time on really big topics, including what rules we should have post Citizens United. And one of the reasons why the FEC has done so little for so long is the structure of not having an odd number of votes on the commission, like every other entity at the federal level. So if you look over at the Securities and Exchange Commission, 5 commissioners, majority rules. It like every other commission at the federal level is like that, with the exception of the Election Assistance Commission, which is also an even number of commissioners, and they similarly have deadlocks and don't get much done. And it's really tragic that the 2 commissions that are like this are the ones that are supposed to help out our democracy and to make it function better. And the commissions themselves, because of their design, don't function. So the FEC has basically been a mess for, at this point, decades. And, if there's going to be meaningful reform, I think what Congress needs to do is make the FEC similar to other agencies and commissions and just put an odd number of commissioners and make it majority rule. But because of partisan deadlock, it's very unlikely that the reform of the Federal Election Commission is in the cards.
That's crazy. That was the idea, or that was the layout that people decided on in the 70s, and 2, that it hasn't been changed. But to your point, it's a very partisan effort. And even in the little research I did, it looks like all of the commissioners are appointed.
They are, but, the commissioners at every federal agency are appointed.
Right. They're appointed, and they're supposed to be 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. I was confused by the ever reliable Wikipedia. Are they term limited?
They are, but some of them have been around for a gajillion terms as well, because it's such a fight to replace the FEC commissioners that they just have these holdover commissioners who have been there for a long time. So yeah, in theory they have term limits, but it's like everything else about the FEC, it's broken.
Yeah, that was very wild and confusing. So now that we know we can't count on the FEC to kind of rein in election spending or regulate it, what options do we have? Is it something that needs to come from the president's desk? Is it something that needs to come from Congress. As a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, what can we do to kind of rein in spending and eliminate these like dark money forces and bad actors in the process?
Well, ultimately, there are, I guess, a few ways of looking at this. Number one, we still have a federal system, which means that if Congress fails us, there's always improvements that can be done at the state and local level. So one thing is, if you feel like you can't work on reform with Congress, work on it locally or in your state. And this is especially true in half of the states where there are ballot initiatives or referenda as a way of direct democracy. Like, you can change the laws literally by voting on them. And one of the reforms that people have voted in is, more transparency, restrictions on corporations spending in particular elections, more public financing for elections. And all of those can happen at the state and local level. But ultimately, Congress has got to get its act together. There are lots of different problems with campaign finance, including one I think we have not gotten to, which is the dark money problem. So the dark money problem, in a nutshell, is that there's an enormous amount of money being spent in our federal, state, and local elections that is not traceable. And it's not traceable for sort of a confluence of tax law and campaign finance law reasons. But the upshot is that even with a lot of due diligence, a voter cannot figure out where this dark money really came from. And one of the reasons that's true is Congress needs to keep up with technology. So one of the ways that dark money is used today is to buy digital ads. So, a couple decades ago, the way that political campaigns were run was heavily reliant on TV and radio. Right now, it's heavily reliant on trying to get into your social media feeds. And when you see a political ad in the middle of your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed or whatever social media you are on, there is a very high chance that that ad was paid for with dark money. And the reason why it's dark is our laws were written in 2002 at the federal level. And when they were written in 2002, Facebook didn't exist, Twitter didn't exist. Like, all of these different social media platforms literally did not exist when these laws were written. And so the ads that appear on Facebook or Twitter or on social media are technically not required to disclose much at all about their funding. There are sort of narrow exceptions to that, but that is the general rule of thumb. And thus, people have figured that out, and so they have spent millions and millions of dollars, especially in the 2020 election, on political Facebook ads in particular. And all of that is dark money, and it can't be traced to its original donor. So part of what Congress needs to do is dust off the statutes and add digital to what needs to be disclosed. And I think that would go a long way in helping inform voters about who is trying to influence them. And then the other fixes are sort of more technical and in tax and campaign finance, that essentially you have to have rules that capture the flow of money in politics. And so you can't just allow someone to route it through an opaque nonprofit and then say, haha, all y'all yucks and free. I don't have to tell you anything about it. It's sort of ridiculous, but that is where our law is right now. And that is a piece that only Congress can fix. There is one other route that I work on, which is trying to get the Securities and Exchange Commission. I know, totally exciting. But they're the people who regulate publicly traded corporations. And it's the publicly traded corporations who have more money running through a particular corporation than run through many nations. And that is why I focus on them. Mm-hmm. And fortunately for us, the Securities and Exchange Commission, their founding documents are all about disclosure. So the 33 Act and the 34 Act in securities law, all about disclosure. So I would make the argument that the Securities and Exchange Commission actually doesn't need Congress to make a new law in order for them to make a new rule that says no dark money can flow from a publicly traded corporation into an American election. So I've been on this hobby horse for quite some time at this point, and there have been little glimmers of light over at the commission. So, and we have a new administration. We'll see whether they follow through and make better disclosure rules, not just on money and politics. They could also make far better disclosure rules around climate risk. And since you started your podcast with a reference to the ocean being on fire, which is not hyperbole. So there's so many things that could be changed and improved. And this is one of those moments where it could happen. There's a Democrat in the White House.
Yes.
Both houses of Congress are Democrats. This is their chance. And so we'll see whether they can follow through.
Fingers crossed. And I have two questions. One, to kind of confirm where money comes from when people are donating to a campaign or involved in the process. So you can make a straight up donation on the candidate's website. There's a limit on that. You can give money to a super PAC. There's no limit on that. But we know who is funding the super PACs. Is that correct?
So generally, we're supposed to know who is funding the super PACs because they are technically required to be actually clear about where they got their money in politics. Mm-hmm. Now, functionally, if you have one of these more opaque entities, so if I am trying to hide my identity in politics, what I will do is I will find an opaque entity to give money to, and then that opaque entity will spend in politics. And one of the ways that they can spend in politics is to spend through a super PAC. So what you can see on Open Secrets, which is a great website if you want to track what you can track in the flow of campaign finance money, you find your favorite super PAC, you can find the list of donors, but when you find one of these sort of more opaque entities in the list of donors, you are not going to be able to see behind that entity. So on the one hand, you can tell that whatever it is Americans for America has given to another super PAC, but you may not be able to find out who funded Americans for America. And in 2016, there was some concern that some of this money may be foreign. And because at the time Trump was in the White House, both houses of Congress were Republican in his first 2 years, there was no appetite to really look into that. And what I hope is eventually we'll get either congressional oversight that looks back at the 2016 election. Like, I feel like we still haven't really tackled that one yet. And or what just happened in 2020. Like, it would seem sort of absurd to me that foreign actors did not try. If they tried in 2016, they didn't try in 2020 and won't try again in 2022. And I feel like that is one of the places where there might be some bipartisanship, because I would just hope that Americans could agree that whatever, the tumult of our elections, that it should be decided by Americans.
Right.
And that foreign money really should have zero role in deciding who is our president or who runs for Congress or who wins in these elections. So I feel like there are chances for some common ground, but they are few and far between.
Definitely. I'm going to jump back to the SEC. I know everyone's favorite topic. And you mentioned the SEC has rules in place, unlike its cousin, the FEC, in terms of like being able to get information. There's already things that these publicly traded companies are disclosing. This is a very random question. What's the line item for these dark money donations? Like, how are they, if you have any insight into like how they're putting that on their, accounting statements, or how they're kind of hiding it, in the weeds?
Yeah. So on the one hand, shareholders over the past decade have been yelling at their own corporations, and they've been using the securities laws, which allow shareholders to put what are known as shareholder resolutions on the annual corporate proxy, which is when you vote on corporate matters. And part of what shareholders have put in those shareholder resolutions is a request for more transparency of corporate political spending. And the good news is that hundreds more publicly traded corporations, compared to the day Citizens United was decided, have responded to that pressure from their own investors, and they are far more transparent than they were. Mm-hmm. All of that transparency is voluntary. So if they decide tomorrow, like, this transparency isn't working for us, they can just shut down and go dark again. Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the disclosure to the investing public, right now, the SEC doesn't have a rule that requires a corporation to tell its investors where it's spending in politics. And that's what I hope will eventually change. Mm-hmm. In terms of internal accounting, they have to keep track of this. And one of the reasons that they have to keep track of this is that tax rule we touched on lightly. It's not tax deductible. It's mm-hmm. not a business expense that can reduce their taxable income. Thus, they have to actually keep track when they make these donations that they're not trying to take a tax advantage, which would break the tax laws. So somewhere in all of these corporations, there's some accountant who knows exactly how much they're spending, because it has to be accounted for differently than, overhead, R&D, salaries for employees. Like, that's in a different category. And so that's one of the arguments I would make for why just tell the public about this. You already have to account for this internally. Yep. Just tell the rest of us so that we can make choices about where we invest our money, which products we buy and support. I mean, one of the things that has been really fascinating is watching all of these corporations after January 6th said that they would stop supporting the Sedition Caucus. And lots of those corporations have reneged on those pledges. We just had the 6-month anniversary of that. And it was sort of deflating to see how many corporations went back on their word. But on the other hand, people are actually tracking that, which is I think, a step in the right direction, and a step in terms of accountability, and accountability both in the corporate governance sense, that these companies should be more accountable to their own investors, and accountability in the democratic sense, that we should know who is funding the people who didn't want to certify a presidential election.
It has been interesting to follow the money, in a sense. There's a Twitter account I follow, and the guy always kind of calls out companies and has reached out to companies to get their comment on it. And they're like, well, we feel like it's okay now. Everybody forgot, which is usually the line. But before we wrap it up, you kind of alluded to it your SEC work as your hobby horse. Can I ask how you chose this area of law?
So I was a corporate lawyer before I was an elections attorney. And I thought when I joined the Brennan Center, I was working at Arnold and Porter before in corporate law. I thought when I joined the Brennan Center that I would never have to practice corporate law ever again. And I was very pleased with that because practicing corporate law is just extraordinarily boring. And then Citizens United happened. And then I had to dust off all of my old corporate law skills, which have actually served me well in the long term. And I was able to write about what Citizens United would mean for shareholders. And what I talked about in some of those writings was that corporations don't have any duty to disclose to their own investors, and investors don't have the ability to consent to any of this corporate political spending. And so I think there's still going to be years of debate about how much disclosure do corporations have to give their investors. And is it appropriate for shareholders to vote on future political spending? But our cousins in the UK actually have a system of both disclosure and consent. So in the UK, if you are invested in a UK company, you get to vote as a shareholder on the future political budget of that corporation. And the corporation is not allowed to spend more. And if they do, their directors are in trouble. Let me put it that and that's a type of accountability, and that incentivizes British corporations to be less spendy in UK elections than we have over here with the $100 million of corporate spending in the 2020 election.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. So those are all my questions. And this was fascinating to get some insight into the cash flow in the U.S. Campaign system. Any knowledge you want to impart with listeners as we wrap up? Is there anything we didn't cover?
Well, if you want to read about any of this, I've written 2 books. One is called Corporate Citizen, which is really about Citizens United. And then I wrote a book called Political Brands, which is really about the 2016 election and how branding has overtaken truth in our politics.
100%. Well, actually, can I ask one last question based on that, branding overtaking politics?
Sure.
And maybe I just need to read your book to get the answer, but how much of the branding overtaking politics has driven the campaign fundraising cycle to the entirety of your term?
So Trump, to my knowledge, is the first individual to have his reelection campaign start on his inauguration day.
Mm-hmm.
And Trump, even before he got into politics, was a master of branding. I mean, obviously, he got his name on all sorts of products, lots of buildings, and then the presidency. And part of what he is really masterful at doing is just repeating a particular message. And so whether it was drain the swamp during the 2016 campaign or make America great again, he's really clever at messaging. And what's really disturbing about it is that his new message is the big lie, is that the 2020 election was stolen. Mm-hmm. And this could have a pernicious effect on our democracy for years to come. And people underestimate this man and shouldn't. His ability to stay on message means that his messaging gets stuck in people's minds, even who disagree with him. And part of influencing another person is just hammering a message. And he is extraordinarily talented at that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, enough about that guy. That is the end of our interview. Well, I don't want to discount him. Like you just said, people do or underestimate him because it's worked for him, which is, as you said, very dangerous. But Ciara, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of That Can't Be Right. I will include the links to her books in the episode description. So if this conversation wasn't enough, you can go learn some more, which is always a good thing. And that's it. Make sure you're following That Can't Be Right on Twitter and Instagram at TCBRPod. Please leave a review, like and subscribe, tell a friend, and just be mindful where your money's going in the 2022 midterms. Have a great week.